The homeless man Richard coldly rejected steps back into his restaurant, this time in a designer suit driving a sleek sports car. "You owe me an apology," he says, eyes gleaming with a power Richard never saw coming. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Balthazar's Grill had always been more than just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary of refinement. Its polished wood floors gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers, and the quiet hum of clinking glasses and polite conversations filled the air. Richard Bailey had cultivated this ambiance carefully, like a meticulous craftsman shaping the perfect dish. To him, every detail mattered. Every customer's experience, every bite of food, and even the very air they breathed in his restaurant had to be flawless. His empire, built from nothing, demanded nothing less. On this particular cold afternoon, Richard was deep in his routine, reviewing orders, ensuring his staff was efficient, and keeping a watchful eye on the well-dressed patrons who filled his restaurant. It was as though the space itself exhaled wealth and success, like an exclusive club reserved for the privileged. Richard had worked tirelessly to keep it that way. He believed in the idea of earned success, that only those who had struggled, worked hard, and conquered their circumstances deserved a seat at his table. So, when the door swung open, bringing in the chill of the city and a stranger in tattered clothes, it felt like a disruption, a threat to the controlled environment Richard had cultivated. The man's disheveled appearance stood in stark contrast to the crisp suits and polished shoes of the other diners. His worn shoes squelched on the floor as he shuffled forward, pausing just inside the door. His face was pale, gaunt from hunger or hardship, and his eyes, wide with something that could only be described as desperation, darted nervously around the room before settling on Richard. The man's voice, small but steady, trembled through the air. "Excuse me, sir. Could I have a meal? Just something to eat, please?" His words hung there for a moment, fragile but hopeful. Richard's eyes flickered up, scanning the man with a mixture of indifference and disdain. His mind worked swiftly, calculating the impact of allowing such a figure into his pristine space. What would the other diners think? Would they feel uncomfortable, perhaps even unsafe, with this man sitting among them? Richard didn't even let his face soften. His years of experience in the business had trained him to maintain an unwavering front. He could see what he needed to see: the unkempt hair, the filthy jacket, the hands that shook slightly as they rested by his sides. "No." Richard's reply was as cold as the drizzle outside. "I'm sorry, but we don't serve your kind here." The words felt final, decisive, a wall between them. The homeless man's face fell instantly, the flicker of hope extinguishing in his eyes. He nodded silently, as though he had expected the rejection, and began to turn away, his movements slow, reluctant. Richard's gaze followed the man as he made his way back to the door, still hunched, as if the weight of his humiliation had already begun to settle on his shoulders. And yet, as the man stepped into the rain, Richard could not shake the fleeting image of him, his thin frame hunched under the downpour, a figure swallowed by the city. But no, Richard thought, there was no time for empathy. He had a restaurant to run, an image to maintain. He had earned his place, his success, and no ragged soul would be allowed to tarnish that. With a shrug, Richard turned back to his duties, his mind already erasing the encounter. The man was gone. Just another inconvenience in a day of many quickly forgotten. Yet somewhere in the recesses of his mind, a faint trace of unease lingered. Not enough to change anything, but enough to keep the image of the homeless man's quiet departure just out of reach of full oblivion. The evening had unfolded as any other. Richard was accustomed to the rhythm of his restaurant, the ebb and flow of patrons, the clink of silverware, and the low murmur of conversations that filled the space as his staff moved with practiced grace. As the last few guests trickled out and the city's nightlife crept in, he began to prepare for closing, a small flicker of fatigue stirring beneath the surface of his carefully composed demeanor. The restaurant, his pride and joy, was quieter now, its golden glow dimming slightly as the hour grew late. He moved through the space, straightening chairs, wiping down counters, absorbed in the usual closing tasks. Then came the sound that seemed out of place, a sharp, reverberating growl of an engine that pierced the quiet street outside. It was almost too loud for the time of night, too assertive for a space so steeped in elegance. Richard, pausing mid-motion, turned toward the windows. He could see the silhouette of a sleek, dark sports car pulling to a smooth stop at the curb. The headlights briefly illuminated the rain-slicked street before the engine cut out with a final decisive purr. Richard's gaze fixed on the vehicle, the polished surface of it catching the light, its sleek curves out of place against the backdrop of his aging brick exterior. A tall, sharply dressed figure emerged from the car, the door clicking shut with a solid finality that seemed to echo through the empty streets. The man was impeccable. Tailored suit, crisply pressed shirt, polished shoes that gleamed even in the dim light of the street lamps. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered every room he entered. Richard's eyes narrowed, his mind processing the image before it clicked. For a moment, it felt as if time had frozen, an unsettling pause between what he was seeing and what he knew. The face was eerily familiar, but something was wrong. This man was not just another patron. This man was the man, the one he had turned away. The transformation was almost too dramatic to grasp. The gaunt, hunched figure he had dismissed just days ago, his clothes barely hanging on his frame, had been replaced by someone unrecognizable in his pristine attire. His posture was straight, his expression calm, and his air one of absolute control. Richard blinked, unable to reconcile the two versions of the man before him. He had dismissed him so easily, so thoughtlessly. Had he been wrong? No. It was impossible, wasn't it? It couldn't be. The man approached, and the sound of his footsteps against the polished wood floor was like a drumbeat in the silence that now enveloped the space. Richard stood frozen at the front desk, hands clasped behind him, his pulse quickening. The stranger's eyes locked onto his with an unsettlingly knowing gaze. As he reached the front desk, the man's voice broke the tension, cool and measured yet sharp. "Mr. Bailey, I believe you owe me an apology." Richard's breath caught, and for a fleeting moment he stood speechless, the words caught in his throat. There was something in the way the man said it, too casual, too assured, that threw him off balance. His eyes flickered downward, unable to settle before he forced himself to speak. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I know you." The man smiled, the edges of his mouth curling ever so slightly, as if amused by Richard's disorientation. It was the smile of someone who had already won, who knew something Richard didn't. "Oh, I think you do," he replied, his tone even but laced with a subtle weight. "A few days ago, you rejected my request for a meal. Perhaps you didn't recognize me then, but you'll know who I am now." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Richard's stomach twisted as the recognition clicked into place. The homeless man, the one he had so easily cast aside with nothing but cold dismissal, was standing before him now, in a suit that could have cost more than his entire restaurant. The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. The man wasn't just some beggar, some lost soul. He was James Lawson, heir to the Lawson fortune, a name that had graced every headline, every philanthropic gala, every conversation in the circles Richard had longed to be a part of. James Lawson, the scion of one of the wealthiest families in the city, a man who wielded power with the ease of someone born to it. And here he was, standing in front of Richard, demanding an apology for the indignity he'd suffered at Richard's hands. A cold chill slid down Richard's spine. He had dismissed this man, this titan, with the arrogance of someone too certain of his own position, too caught up in his own small world of curated exclusivity. And now, it was impossible to ignore the weight of the moment. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The sharp sting of realization cut through him like a blade. His mind raced, the edges of his thoughts blurred with the weight of the moment. James Lawson. The name echoed in his head like a distant warning he had never heard, a sound he had dismissed too easily. This was the man he had rejected. This was the man who could shatter everything he had built. James stood before him, tall and unmoved, his posture perfectly straight. The man radiated an unsettling calm, as though he had expected this encounter, as though he knew exactly what effect his presence would have. Richard, on the other hand, felt every shred of composure he had worked so hard to maintain crumble away. His palms were slick with sweat, and he could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, choking him. "You see, Mr. Bailey," James spoke again, his voice low but filled with a quiet power that demanded attention. "I've been watching your restaurant for some time. I've seen the way you treat your employees, your customers, and even those you deem unworthy of your attention. I've learned a lot about you in the past few days." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut, each one harder than the last. It was as though the walls of his carefully constructed life were collapsing around him, the security he had so painstakingly built now crumbling into dust. How many times had he turned a blind eye to those who didn't fit his idea of success? How many times had he ignored the ones who didn't matter in his world? Richard's mind raced to defend himself, but his voice faltered. I never intended to offend you. I just... No need for excuses," James interrupted, his voice still calm, but with a firmness that felt like a command. "I'm not here for that. I've come to offer you an opportunity for you to change, to understand what it means to be kind, to be compassionate, not just to people who can benefit you, but to everyone." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He had built his empire on the idea that people earned their place, that the world worked on a system of merit. People had to work for their success. But now, faced with James's words, the cracks in that belief began to form, widening slowly. It felt like a mirror being held up to the parts of himself he had long kept hidden. He was a man of calculated decisions, of sharp edges, and here was a man offering something far different, an idea of humanity that Richard had long since rejected. James paused for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch between them like a taut wire. "You rejected me not because I'm undeserving, but because you thought I was beneath you," James said, each word imbued with a quiet certainty that stung Richard deeper than any accusation. "But what I am offering you today is something far greater than a mere apology. You see, I know what it's like to be underestimated, to be seen as nothing more than a person, to be discarded." Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The image of the man he had dismissed, the frail, desperate figure, flashed before his eyes. It was too late now to take back the scorn he had shown, too late to undo the damage done in those few moments of superiority. "But I am not just some beggar." James's voice grew softer, yet no less intense. "I am the one who holds the power to change your future." Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. Power. The word lingered, settling uneasily in his chest. He had always seen himself as the one in control, the one making the decisions. But James Lawson wasn't just any man. He was someone who could turn the tables with the flick of a wrist, someone who had the power to dismantle Richard's world if he so wished. Richard stood there, speechless, trapped by his own arrogance and the weight of his own ignorance. Nothing he said now could undo the mistake he had made. James smiled, and it was a smile that sent a chill through Richard's veins, a smile that conveyed more than just amusement. It was the smile of a man who knew he had already won. "I've bought your restaurant, Richard," James said, his tone devoid of malice, but cutting through Richard's pride with surgical precision. "It's time for you to learn what true humility means." The words hung in the air, reverberating with a finality that Richard couldn't escape. The life he had built, the empire he had crafted with his own two hands, now felt fragile, like glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, suffocating him. There was no escaping it, no denying the reality that had just been thrust into his fate. James Lawson wasn't just a figure of wealth and power. He was the reckoning Richard had never seen coming, and it had arrived with a precision he couldn't hope to match. Months had passed since that life-altering confrontation, and Richard's world had shifted in ways he could never have predicted. The sleek, polished walls of Balthazar's Grill, once a temple of exclusivity and wealth, were now softened by the warmth of humble changes. The glassy, intimidating atmosphere that had repelled those less fortunate had given way to an environment of welcome and openness. Gone were the private rooms for the elite, replaced by communal spaces where families from all walks of life shared a meal together. There was no longer a proper clientele. There was only a community. Richard had learned to shed his arrogance piece by piece, until the man who stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up and apron tied around his waist, barely resembled the person he had been just a few months ago. The restaurant's transformation mirrored his own personal journey. No longer the owner of an empire that was built on power and status, but a participant in something greater. Now, he worked side by side with the very people he once dismissed, those whose lives had been weighed down by circumstances, by homelessness, by poverty. And yet, those very individuals had proven to him that kindness, not wealth, defined worth. The kitchen no longer rang with the sharp commands of a boss barking orders from above. Instead, it hummed with cooperation as Richard and his colleagues worked as equals. His days were no longer spent cultivating a world of exclusivity and unattainable luxury. Instead, he found himself preparing meals that would nourish bodies and souls. The menu had changed, but it wasn't just the food that was different. It was the intent behind each dish, every serving made with the awareness that someone would be fed, not just for their hunger, but for their dignity. Richard watched as a group of volunteers, many of them once in the same place he had been, drifting between the margins,